The voice of sharing. Durian ASEAN.
Hi, this is Arlene, and you are listening to Durian ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. Today, we have Ahmad, Fuad, Rahmat. He's a teacher from Sekolah Falsafah, which is a class that teach philosophy, and also he's a lecturer at Notingham University. Today, he's going to speak about Freud's analysis on sexual repression. Welcome to Durian ASEAN.
Hi.
Today is a very interesting topic because we are talking about quite a taboo topic in today's society. So, what do you see when it comes to sexual repression in today's society?
Well, there are many ways to understand sexual repression. First of all, what the way I usually use when I teach it or when I write about it is to engage with Freud. Sigmund Freud is an Austrian psychoanalyst, and he basically started a long and rich discourse through psychoanalysis about repression in general, and largely its relationship with what he calls the unconscious. And essentially his claim is that there's something universal and something very basic about the idea of repressing sexual drives. And this is largely something that humans have to do just to function as a society. So if you think about it, sexual drives are drives that human beings have at a relatively young age. But unlike other drives, like hunger or anger, they cannot really be expressed openly, right?
And why do you think it cannot be expressed openly?
Well, because it's for many reasons: social taboos, instability, the disruption of the kind of family hierarchy or order. So, out of all the drives, the sexual drives that are most repressed, and it's repressed at an individual level, and it's also repressed socially, through various mechanisms. Religion is one example. If you talk about Islam in religion context, but also through other means, through the education system, governmental institutions, so on and so forth. So the human person goes through all these levels of repression, either internalized or set up as institutions and pressures for conformity.
Is sexual repression something normal in today's and also in yesterday's society?
Well, it's normal. For Freud, it's normal for as long as human beings have been civilized and have arranged themselves in communities,
Mm-hmm.
And what's happened for him as society gets more modern, as history becomes supposedly more technological, more civilized, quote unquote, the repression mechanism gets more intense. So now, if you look at just a modern capitalist society, you repress yourself in a variety of ways, right? For example, through work. Work is this basic everyday example of how we repress ourselves. Not all of us like our jobs. Not all of us are happy with the terms in which we do our work, but we have to repress the anger, we have to repress that dissatisfaction and just go ahead with it, right? And that already takes a big chunk of life, right?
So, when we touch on work and you talk about how much we need to, some people repress their feeling towards work. Maybe the burden of work or the hatred towards doing certain tasks. But what about Nietzsche's view on you need to work hard and you need to endure hardship in order for you to be able to be a better person or to be a Superman? Is it similar in terms of the way Freud and Nietzsche see in terms of hard work, in terms of repression?
No, for Freud, you channel your drives towards life enhancement. So for Nietzsche, neither Freud or Nietzsche thinks that you should just let go. You know, the solution is not just to go crazy and be like, be
YOLO.
unaccountable. Yeah, YOLO. No, it's not that. It's not like that. The idea for both is, well, for Freud, the ego must be in control of the drives, and it must individualize its relationship to the drive as such that the person can become functional, doesn't become disruptive, you know. For Nietzsche, he has a more aesthetic, a kind of artistic notion of overcoming weakness, right? So, but this doesn't mean that the drives just go haywire, you do what you want. It means you cultivate your drives in a way that you enhance yourself, you know. So, but both recognize that human beings, because we are part of the natural world, we are like animals, we have drives. You know, we want to do things to satisfy ourselves biologically, whether it's food or sex. The question here is, as human beings, we've become too self-aware, too self-conscious to the point where we believe that, you know, we must contain or manage sexual desires, and in a way that society must preserve itself.
I see. What else that Freud sort of found out when he did this study on sex?
A lot of things. For one, there is the repression must go somewhere. You know, there's the pleasure principle and the reality principle. Pleasure principle is desire to satisfy yourself, and then the reality principle is this desire to acknowledge that, you know, you cannot just do what you want, right? So most of the time we are in a state of minor neurosis or something, where we're just torn between these desires that call out to us biologically, and you know, that we want to release, but at the same time social confines, you know. So in a lot of ways, all of us, we're ambivalent, you know. We go about life kind of suspended between this desire to just let go and this desire to conform. They're very contradictory, right? Because to let go your drive is to just do what you want and express your inner urges. But you can't do that freely. So we're all kind of stuck, and that's why we can become violent too, because we cannot resolve that tension.
What do you mean by violent? Is it like violent towards society? Like, are you referring to the case? I mean, the infamous case recently on Elliot Rogers?
Not particularly, but that's a good example, right? I mean, he in his writings, he's quite open to confessing that he was sexually deprived. He hated good-looking people because they were sexually active, and he even targeted. He said that, you know, in his manifesto before he went on his rampage, he said that, you know, I'm going to target good-looking people first because presumably they have better sex lives, right? So all that pent-up repression escaped in that terrible, heinous form of murder, but it doesn't have to take that form, you know. So say somebody's repressed, you know, for decades because of a terrible job. He has no control. He has to let it go somewhere. So it could take the form of domestic violence. It could be even take the form of food. People eating more than they need to emotionally, because that's a way of releasing the pent-up repression, right?
Well, to talk about statistics, Malaysia is one of the most obese nation in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, we're probably the most. I think after Brunei, we are probably the most repressed nation. So somebody should cross-tabulate the findings. Maybe there's a relationship, you know.
Yeah, but then
what's interesting too, since this year, I find interesting, are the stadium riots.
Ah, okay. What is that?
Yeah, you know, there's been football riots. January. You know, whenever, you know, usually when it's JDT, the Johor team plays, there'll be some kind of riot or something after the game. And I find it's interesting. It's a largely majority, 90% Malay crowd, and they're finally, interestingly enough, you know, when, you know, stones are thrown, chairs are being ripped off. I mean, these are violent behavior that you don't see regularly, and it's becoming part of the subculture of football.
But how you link it to sexual repression? Because I mean, the
hold
situation
on,
is.
yeah. I'm trying to explain. So, it's repression in general. It doesn't have to be sexual, right? So, repression is when you cannot release your what natural urges that you have, and work is one good way in which we repress ourselves. But economic instability, living a very uncertain life politically, all these things formulate repressed phenomena in human beings, But where do they go, right? I mean, for Freud, it has to go somewhere. So we have to, if we are using this perspective, we have to look at, okay, there is a lot of self-censorship, self-regulation, repression going on. So the question here is, where does that go? And I find this football violence here interesting because it's happening at a time when the economy is getting bad. It's happening at a time when the Malay political power is being questioned. And so it's a way of violence being channeled out, So a Freudian perspective would say, okay, this isn't divorced from other things. So you have to look at how it's related. But of course, nobody's done research to connect the two yet. But if you look at a Freudian perspective, it would connect all these moments of aggression with repression as well.
I'm quite curious why you raised the issue on stadium riot, because another country that I think is famous for stadium riot would probably be in the UK. Whenever they have opposing team and they are not happy, dissatisfied with the result or something else, there will always be some sort of riot. And of course, the infamous London riot last year.
Yeah.
So, would you be able to connect this to something much more like larger, such as sexual repression or certain kind of repression by the state or something?
Yeah, because for Freud, I think for Malaysia, the most obvious mechanism of repression is religion. Either it's enforced by the state, or if it manifests in a culture of conformity. Religion has become this veil or foil to repress. But for Freud, his observations were largely towards the European context, and he even noticed repression in the European context. So that shows that repression is very, for him, universal, something that human beings just have to do so that society doesn't crumble, right? So like you said, I think you rightly said. I mean, it's not even that uncommon for people to associate the London riots. I think it's 2012 with some form of repressed life, whether it's in terms of economics or in terms of powerlessness, right? So when you're powerless, you keep a lot inside. You cannot express your anger, you cannot express dissatisfaction. You just go on with life, and you build in a fear of frustration. At some point, that has to come out. And in London, it was interesting that it happened at a very difficult time economically for Britain, and it happened among the poor and the politically disenfranchised.
Yeah, and it happened also among the younger generation rather than a mixed group.
And that's a very interesting point you raised, because for Freud, repression happens very young. You're taught to repress at a young age. And that's why a lot of teenagers, they get aggressive, because all that has to go somewhere, So that's why there's a lot of bullying, there's a lot of, hierarchy, and there's a lot of all those things that happen when you're a kid. I mean, we've been kids before. We know that there's a lot of repression. We know there's a lot of aggression, And the task of the state is to mold students, youth, and teenagers to be ordered and orderly, so that they will not be too aggressive, in their conduct.
But I'm still quite curious, why society or the state want to repress individuals or society themselves. If it doesn't really get the results that that they want, why they are doing this? Do they have a certain ideal society that they want to create, or do they have a very negative connotation towards sex?
Well, all you have to really think about, just a thought experiment is, what if people just go around and have free sex, right? You have unwanted pregnancies. You'll have, you know, a lot of people getting jealous. You probably have a lot of, I don't know, STDs or something, and it just ripples into
But is that
more
true?
and more problems.
I mean, is that true? This would be the result of, free sex? Because there are society, especially society in Scandinavia, where, sex is not a taboo subject, and they still have avenues and protection mechanism towards the diseases of sex, and also controlling the population through condoms and all that. But I mean, it doesn't result a less moral society.
No, I definitely don't think so. I don't think that more sex makes you less moral. It's just the fear that people have, when about sex, that it's such a basic desire, and it's such and it has, and for Freud, the reason why people are afraid of sex, because they don't do it for procreation, they do it for pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And human beings can have endless amount of pleasure for themselves, But I mean, even in Scandinavia, there are, of course, it's much better than Malaysia in many ways, in this sense. But there's still repression in the sense that you still have to work. You can't just have sex at work or have sex, in the afternoon. Right?
That would be an ideal society, I guess.
Yeah, or ideal is you don't have to work and you just follow your desires, right? Like a communist society or something.
Or a hippie society.
Yeah. So there's still, but you're right. It's much better. They've managed it much better. So they have safety nets. They have, like you say, free, abortion that's supported by the state, medicine that's supported by the state, so on and so forth. But they're still, in a way, within certain boundaries as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, and part of it is the myths that human beings create for themselves, because for Freud, and since you mentioned Nietzsche, especially for Nietzsche, I mean, they're both naturalists.
Mm-hmm.
They both look at human beings as biological creatures. That means we are animals first, humans second. So, like, if you take the evolutionary perspective, that's what you see. You're part of nature, and other animals. Humans are the ones that actually have self-conscious, in the sense that we are aware. We think about ourselves. For example, the most easy example is that, the clothes we wear.
Mm-hmm.
We have to have clothes on because we have notions of shame and pride.
Mm-hmm.
A heavy notion, very heavy, robust notion of shame and pride. Cats or monkeys, they don't need to wear clothes, They just go out.
But the idea of shame
yeah.
and, shame towards our own body, the origin of this, is it from religion or from the idea that, the divine would sort of give you retribution if you didn't follow certain societal rules or ethics?
Yeah, and that, but also a more fundamental point is just the sense for for us that we need meaning. We're meaning-seeking creatures.
Mm-hmm.
And this is meaning across the board, not just religiously. We need value in existing, in itself. Not of course we prize life, but we want existence to be valuable too.
But don't you think meaning can be found even with free sex and being naked? I'm just trying an idea.
I think so, but people are afraid of that, right? People are afraid of that, and in a lot of ways, the moment for human beings to take that path is kind of lost now. There's probably back 10,000 years ago, that would have been more possible than it is today. Because today there's a capitalist economy. You have to work. You have to. And this is,
it makes society more organized as well, as in like you become more routine towards your daily tasks,
And for Freud, that's repressive,
I see.
Because routine is man-made. It's not some kind of natural given order, right? It's human beings man-made. Capitalism is man-made. All these things that we do to ourselves that deny us our basic animal drives. So of course, many of even in the developed countries unhappy, because they have to repress To get ahead in life, to do well in your career, all that requires repression.
When Freud did his study, majority of his idea of repression comes from, is it the family or the state or the society or the individuals
Both.
in him or herself?
He started out largely with individual because he's actually trained as a doctor. So he was, he had individual patients. But as his work progressed, he became more interested in social questions. So the book that I personally like is a book called Civilization and Its Discontent. Civilization and Discontents, where it ties up together, So for him, to understand society, you have to understand individuals. And to understand individuals, you have to understand society. There's this link between the individual and society. So when the individual is repressed, it's because he's part of a repressed society, And where there's a repressive society, it's because the individuals internalize the repression, So he looks at, so there's a connection between the individual cases and the larger social context.
And he has an extensive idea in terms of trying to explain the human nature itself, the human emotion. I still remember you say something about ego, superego, and another one. I can't remember.
So the main division is the unconscious and the conscious, right? The conscious is basically what you hear in your head when you're thinking, and this is carried through by language, right? Language represents phenomena, right? And this phenomena is when you're thinking, the conscious phenomena is what language captures, right? So unconscious is created by repression. So when you repress your drives for sex, but other drives too, when you repress your anger, and you even repress your happiness, and you repress a lot of things, it creates an unconscious, and it creates a layer of thoughts, memories that are not immediately accessible or even clear to us. And in fact, for Freud, it's before language, and it doesn't recognize contradictions. So it's just these waves of emotions and feelings that are wrestling inside of you that you have consciously put aside. But for Freud, it doesn't go anywhere. So this unconscious becomes this reservoir of memories, of feelings, of thoughts that you've put aside. And most of the time, it's not clear to you, So because especially as we grow older, we put a lot of things on the side.
Yeah, definitely.
So because that's how we manage life. If we deal with all these pains, you can't get out in the morning to go to work, because you have so many issues, financial issues, family issues.
So what do society do today to deal with all these, issues examples? Watching reality TVs?
Watching reality TV is a form of escapism. There's escape, but for Freud, it's always about confronting what's going on. It's always about, okay, what are the demons and traumas that are affecting you that you've put aside. So this could be something. Usually, a lot of times, it's from the past. So you have to confront that.
And when you talk about the past, you mean the childhood, isn't it?
Childhood, yeah. A lot of times happen in childhood, But sometimes we don't remember. We don't remember our childhood, and the reason why we don't remember it is because we've largely repressed it, So there's that. But there's also this idea that Freud has of the death drive, and the death drive is essentially, this drive that human beings have to want to just release and escape this world. This world's overwhelming. The death drive is this instinct we have to just one day finally achieve relief.
Is that similar to jihad, you're doing this for the future of your...
Jihad is one example of the
death.
death drive. One example of the death drive. But it did not have an afterlife. So you could just want to leave this world without wanting an afterlife. It's entirely possible.
But that sounds more like existentialism.
Not necessarily, because existentialism affirms life despite life meaning
Or nihilism.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but what the death drive wants, for Freud is this desire to just be relieved of this world. Like we said, life is overwhelming. We want to be relieved of it, so we have this death drive. But because we cannot because we also have a life drive, we are again in another ambivalence between wanting to be here and not wanting to be here. And what this creates is destructive behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to what you say, how do people cope? They either escape, or they get destructive. They get abusive. They get violent. They want to do things that are damaging so that they can get in touch with the death drive.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way people do it. But very few people have the capacity to really deal with emotions. Emotions are very powerful, and to deal with it, you need a lot of strength, a lot of patience, and a long time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And talking about Freud's studies, I think he came from an era where sex is taboo. Is that the case, or he came an era where
it was a very Victorian era, and in fact, a lot of times, the problem were not necessarily sexual in nature. Right? It was only as he looks at things, issues further, that he deduces this. So,
and majority of his patients were women, isn't it?
Yeah, many were. Many of the famous cases were women, and but eventually I think what the part of Freud that fascinates me is Freud as a social observer.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what he does. People forget that what he tries to eventually do later on, because he was living and writing a very exciting time in Europe, right? So the World War I happened when he was there to witness it. He was persecuted as a Jew. So for me, his insights are always when he reflected on society. That's his relevance, some of the things that we talk about now. But I want to go back to your earlier question about the ego, the id, and super id. Yeah, super ego. And basically, these are the three, how would you say, layers to our personality.
Mm-hmm.
And it has conscious and unconscious dimensions to it. But ego basically is the I. And it's a controlling mechanism. It's defensive because it takes elements of its encounters with the world to form itself. And then the id are the basic drives, and largely sexual drives.
Mm-hmm.
And these are drives that are pre-rational, they're pre-moral, and the id is basically Latin for it. So there's already a division between the I and the it. The I being the part of the self that's in control, and the it being the part of the self that's not in control. So sexual desire is one thing. You can't control it. You can put it aside, but you can't control it. You can't eradicate it. Something must be done about it. Then you have the superego, which is basically the disciplinarian in you. It's ultra rational. It criticizes. It's the authority that's internalized.
Mm-hmm.
So as a child, when you're disciplined, when you're told what's right and wrong, the idea, it's quite obvious. The idea is for you to internalize that sense of right and wrong. So that forms your superego. So most of the time when you're critical of yourself, you're not good enough, you feel that you're not doing as good as you should be, so on and so forth. It's really the self-criticism is coming really from the superego, So these are the kind of contours in ourselves that Freud identified.
I see. So, what else that in today's society where repression has take rooted in in individuals. I guess I'm giving in the context of Malaysia that you observe and you think that it should be addressed.
Well, I'm not a psychoanalyst. I'm not a psychologist either. I read Freud as a social theorist, and even Freud is not very widely read anymore. I think
see.
Because he took his work to be a science. But I don't know. It's so easy to brush him aside. Part of the problem is that most people haven't read him, but because they just hear some of the theories he had were weird, they'll just very easily brush him off.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things, if you just take into account his notion of repression and the unconscious and how it really shapes culture, one interesting phenomena would be how Malays go about the repression that they have.
I want to give one example that I think is becoming more and more like widespread, which is the idea of purity. Like either in food, in the way you dress, the way you look, your morality. Not your morality is as in like the way you perceive yourself, but more like how you portray to others. And it's like in almost every single aspect in an individual's life. And I don't know whether this has connection with the idea of repression itself.
Yeah, in the sense that to be pure, you need to repress yourself or others from impurity, right? So that requires, and that that ties in for the Malaysian context. That ties in a lot with how religion has become widespread. It's become widespread as a disciplinary force, and in that sense, it's very in line with what you described. And so for me, going back to what I was saying just now, what's interesting here is Malays, we do not talk about sex in general. Our films don't show any kissing. Our films don't even is troubled with sensuality in a certain way, So what happens is that they have to be discussed, whether it's novels or films, they have to be discussed in some religious context, So they always have to have some kind of religious message at the end. They always have to have some kind of a moral message or something. Okay? So that's peculiar to me. And I think one of the things too, like if a Martian came to Malaysia and he looks at Malays and he goes, oh my God, Malays, they probably, they don't, everybody waits until marriage or something. They don't do anything hanky-panky or something like that. But that's what it looks like socially. But all you have to do is start Googling or YouTube or Google Melayu, and it's most of the time it's sexual, right? So when they can get away with it, well, just Google, just write Melayu on Google search space.
And what will you find?
Well, anybody would find it. It would find a variety of sexual links, and you cannot get that.
Pornographic links.
Pornographic links, yeah. So here you have a contradiction. When nobody's watching, everybody's Googling for sex. But outside, everybody just, is so pious, right? So here already you see this split personality.
During Freud's time, does he... did he actually link rape with repression as well? Because I think in a lot of society where repression is widespread, seems like rape itself is a common theme as well.
No, he doesn't tie it up. Not to my knowledge, he doesn't tie it up. But you could. The thing is, once you have the formula, right, where there's repression of these basic drives, and this basic drive must go out in one way or another. Then you can apply it to many cases. Then you have to do the actual research or data gathering to show that. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a link. You can link it with violence. You can link it with domestic violence, social violence, political violence.
Yeah, I'm the reason why I touch on rape because sometimes you see documentaries or you see a society where nudity is not a problem. Uncles, auntie, father, mother, son, daughter, grandchildren, all are naked in one, very, very sort of simple aborigine lives. But they don't have the problem that modern society have. But in today's society, even though you are well dressed, you observe yourself, towards a more pure society. But things like rape and pornography still is something that is widespread among young people as well as old people.
That's a good observation. Well, for Freud, he would say that the more advanced, so-called advanced society becomes, the more repressive we become. Because we have to do more. We have to put aside our desires to do more things. Whereas in a kind of, just to take the, simplistic imagination we typically have about Aborigines or indigenous people, they do not have the same pressures to advance in the way that we do. So I'm born, I was told to be good in school, to be paid well, to be accepted by society, to get a job that can take me to to good careers. And so even growing up, you're just told to repress your desires and get something else out of it. But
and your actual desires was?
Well, there are a lot, it's complex, right? But even, even shopping, right, is a form of release now, right? So there's a lot of these things that we are told to put aside in order for other things. Whereas in a kind of the society you described, there are no malls to go to, so there's no peer pressure, there's no advertising, there's no there's no
Probably their peer pressure will be going hunting, like
something like
what's
that.
your
It's
biggest
minimal,
catch?
exactly. So there is that. There is probably sexual harassment, there's probably rape, but it's definitely a different tone than it is today. Where today it's just become so hypersexualized. And for that, why is it so hypersexualized? Because it's something that sells because people don't have it,
And women majority of the time, women have to carry the burden of this sexual repression. For example, in a lot of society where female genital mutilation, honor killing, and stoning is seen as a normal punishment towards those who do not protect the honor of the family or do not conform to certain ways of society.
Yeah, they do not play along with the repressive factors and pressures.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what is the best way to deal with sexual repression, especially if you grow up in a society where either you're being religiously oppressed or oppressed by the state or oppressed by certain governmental policy and or social structure. How do individuals can sort of release their sexual repression without conforming to society or resort to violence and anger and all that?
Well, education is very important. Basic education, but also therapy is very important too. I don't think people should shy away from getting help, especially adults, because life gets more difficult. Life beats you down, and the usual response is to suppress.
You mean psychology therapy or psychiatry?
Therapy, psychiatrists, psychologists usually, A psychiatrist, you don't get there until things get bad. But although it's not that bad too, some depends what your issues are, but
it's not really a culture in Malaysia, isn't it, to go to?
No, it's not.
Psychologists.
And it's bad too. I mean, it's bad that becomes a culture, and you have other issues where even you have over medication issues. People are too dependent on it too. So I mean, all societies have these problems. It's a matter of degrees. Some it's more, some it's less. But for Malaysia, I think education is very important. To start with the right education, so that you can. Why can't teenagers at 17 or 16 be reading Freud and being exposed to the discussion we're having? It's not that bad, right? Mm-hmm. They're thinking about it anyway. They're doing it anyway. Might as well read some theories about it, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So, slowly but surely these things must happen, or else we become a very repressed society. And for Freud, more repression, the more violent we become.
Mm-hmm. And what about what about like population control? I'm just curious, like in China they used to have, they are having a one-child policy, and even in one time in Singapore they have a stop at two policy. Do you think population control also contributes towards repression?
Oh yeah, definitely.
And why so?
Well, you have to just stop at two or stop at one. And the state tells you if you don't stop, you get punished. That's even more repressive, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a form. Although I don't know, I think it was you who mentioned that Singapore, there's like phenomenally.
Oh yeah.
Something like that. What was the statistic again?
So, so in Singapore, apparently they are having a negative birth rates in terms of the population growth. And what they do, they use in the 70s they used to have stop at two child policy, meaning that if you have more than two kids, you will need to be to pay extra money and sort of be charged by the government. But later on, the government realized it's a wrong policy, and they try to encourage young people to have sex, to get married early, and to have babies. And they did a lot of really, to us, would be very weird way of approach. Like they will have websites and manuals and workshop on how to have sex, how to have adventurous sex outside the home, how to do it in the car, or how to approach a girl, what to do on the first date, what not to do, which I thought is kind of weird because the state is doing this. It's as if it's the responsibility of the state to ensure, young people actually fall in love, which I find it
really
amusing.
Weird. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's so weird. I've never thought about the states, doing that. Yeah. So I have no comments on that. It's very interesting. I got to look it up more.
But the interesting point is, even though the state worked hard on it, but it was a failure in terms of their policy, because the birth rate is still at a negative birth rates, and young people still do not have the hesitant towards having big family and getting married and have frequent sex and all that.
Right. So, yeah, I guess the repression they did the first time helped. I mean, it really was effective.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So that's how, different society, they use different mechanism or different ideology to sort of either repress society or artificially, encourage society to move towards a certain direction.
Yep.
Anything you want to add on in terms of, trying to provide us more idea on Freud's analysis on repression? Oh, I guess, wait, I have one question, like, what is a Freudian slip?
A Freudian slip is when the things that you repress in your unconscious, it escapes through misspeaking. Mm-hmm. So and usually sex. Usually people think about it, but it doesn't have to be sex. So, for example, like if you like rock music, you suddenly say you like cock music. It comes out in that way because you've been sexually repressed. So that is a common, popular term that people use.
Mm-hmm. And that goes to one culture in the Malay society. I'm not sure whether nowadays is still something common. The culture of Melata.
Yeah.
Yeah, you say gibberish thing. Suddenly.
And gibberish things, but it's interesting. It doesn't happen anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have become more repressive. Right now, we're more modern.
Uh-huh.
So maybe that's why it just doesn't. Back then, you Melata, everything comes out and people just laugh around,
Yeah.
Because you are repressed less, right? It just comes out. But now you're more repressed because we're more modern. So maybe there's less Melata.
So we need to bring back the culture of Melata, I guess.
Well, it's more of whatever helps us, for us to resolve the repression in a healthy way. For Freud, that's always good. So.
Mm-hmm. So, any last word to add on before we end?
No, I think this covered a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. So, thanks very much, Ahmad Fuad Rahmat, for speaking with us and enlightening us on sexual repression, actually.
And Freud, actually. Not just, we didn't talk about so much, but yeah. All right. Well, thanks for calling, and